Incoming transmission.
All right, guys, how you doing? Frank here from the XO of the USS Gun, here to talk about a little competition I was running during the weekend and a discussion that came along as a result of it. So, before we start, I'll just get everybody to introduce themselves. So, that's me. John, how about yourself?
Hi, I'm Jono. Everybody at home knows who I am. You catch me regularly on Maker Chat. How you doing?
Absolutely. Next down for me is Felicity.
Yeah, hi, I'm Felicity. I'm on the USS Caroline, and I'm tips fine for generally the person who posts all sorts of silly things online. So you'll see me in all the groups.
Awesome.
Hello, my name is David. I represent the stateside component. I'm attached to USS Blackstone.
Excellent. And John?
Yeah, I'm just doing something. Back it in.
Yep.
Right, yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Well, guys, how's everybody? Been a bit of an improvement in the weather today now, so really lovely day. So, give me a chance to go for a walk and think about doing this and figuring out how to do it with more than just two people. Needs to be working away so far. So, yeah, I ran a competition there at the weekend for a Pride patch and pin. It being Pride month in June, and the last two that we had, and I posed a question, and the question was, who was the first LGBTQ couple in Star Trek? And I was going with the, I suppose what you might call the official line, which is Stamets and Culber. And but an interesting discussion came up to say that well, they're not the first. So I just wanted to get people's opinions on what they feel. Who was the first LGBTQ couple, and as distinct from say representation. So, what do you guys reckon? Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll pipe up first because I was the first to make the alternate comment on the page.
Yeah.
I think I was just thinking, it's kind of a wide question, and I think a lot of what to do is just because you're running a competition is a bit open. So I just kind of went, well, okay, the obvious answer is Culber and Stamets because they're from Discovery and it's quite current, quite recent. But I started, thinking about what has Trek done, and the first couple to me, not a particularly proper couple, but it's got multiple levels. Was what I said was in Deep Space Nine, which was Dax and Khan, and not Khan Noonien Singh now. But I was thinking of that, but that was a kind of multi-layered episode. Now that we think about it, because I don't know if I'm right. Personally, I'm not of the LGBTQ persuasion. I'm straight, but to me, it was a representation of not only trying to tell a lesbian story at a time 25 years ago when that was a very tough thing to do, but you could also consider that a trans story now, I think, as well, because both of them had been both sexes at some stage or another, and they had been married previously in their relationship. And due to their society, the societal rule of the Trill, they had to, once one of them passed on, they that relationship was over, even though the symbiotes would have that. Popping in and out.
You're breaking up.
Don't know. Yeah, sorry. That's all I can do at the moment is blame air. So many people are having problems. It's our internet provider here around the place in Dublin. But I don't know how much was missed there while I was being disturbed by internet. But the whole thing is we were trying to tell a lesbian story. We had a lesbian kiss, and then we also had you could consider it a trans story because they had both changed gender via their Trill host. Or not via the symbiote changing host from one gender to another. So there's a kind of a multi-layered storyline there as well. So to me, they had been a couple, and they were getting back together. So that's where the kind of the conundrum came from me. But as we were kind of discussing in the comments, I think Felicity gave so much more information because she went back to the next generation and what they tried to do with Riker in that episode, and of course Beverly Crusher. Felicity.
Yeah, so in regards to Trill, just taking up from Dax, there is actually a Next Generation episode with Trill, and it's season 4, The Host. And so Beverly Crusher falls in love with a person who then needs a new body. And there have been some fans online who have said that because the Trill have no gender of their own, because they take on pronouns and the gender identity, trans and also then pansexual. The thing is, a lot of the metaphors in Trek are not perfect, even with, say, Dax and Khan. But when it comes to the episode that you're referring to, which I think is The Outcast, it's one of those episodes that occurred following a lot of campaigning from LGBT fans. And it was seen as kind of being a metaphor for conversion therapy. There are criticisms and there are positives to the show. So yes, it was presenting this issue, but obviously it was presenting it in a heteronormative way, which was maybe more palatable to the audience, because obviously it is Riker and someone who we would code as being female. And so when it came to criticism, some people felt that the episode actually, while it did raise issues of conversion therapy, the ending then actually kind of reinforced or sanctioned that this was okay. And like Jonathan Frakes himself has said that the episode wasn't daring enough where it went with Soren, and that Soren should have been more evidently male in presentation. I think one of the main issues that we have when it comes to like Star Trek and LGBT representation is one, Roddenberry himself had issues with the LGBT community initially. It was towards the 90s that they did interviews in which they spoke about how they did want to see an LGBT character on the Next Generation, and they were planning to have representation on the Next Generation. And then we have a producer called Rick Berman, who I think probably threw a spanner in the works for a lot of what could have been within the 90s. Even going back further from that, I mean, we have representation, granted not necessarily on the show, but in regards to the Star Trek fandom, because there were an awful lot of what we would now consider fan fiction, but they were fanzines at the time, which involved Kirk and Spock. And one of the most famous ones is from 1968. It's called The Ring of Soshorn. And basically, Spock goes into Pon farr, and in order to save their life, Kirk obliges. It eventually ends up as a slash fanfiction, which is coded for male on male. And a lot of that fanfiction has led to the fanfiction that we know today. Now, the thing is, this was publicly available. Paramount didn't like it. They did try to destroy the fandom from within. But it's one of those things that it went underground and it has always been there within the fandom. So a lot of times when we see people complaining about maybe the potential for Seven of Nine to possibly be bisexual, the criticism doesn't take into account the history of Trek and the fact that there has been queer representation, queer coding in the show, but there's also been attempts to have explicitly queer characters there, and there have been unaired episodes. Granted, the 90s and Rick Berman has meant that a lot of them have had to go along with metaphors. So there's an unaired episode which was a metaphor to do with AIDS. Again, they're coming from a heteronormative stance. The reason we have these episodes is because LGBT people petitioned for them. They were meant to be that representation, even if they're not perfect. And we have to take into account, the idea of the time. And again, one of the other issues is anytime we do get LGBT representation, such as with The Outcast or with The Host, we end up having a tragic story. And there's a historical there's history behind this because it's a kill your gays trope in which gay characters cannot exist within a show without eventually dying. And interestingly, this can go back to, say, the Victorian era, where people couldn't necessarily discuss these things openly, and so characters would be coded within the narratives with certain stereotypes or stereotypical behavior, so they could be read as being queer. So by trying to oppress queer representation, in a way, that representation is technically still there. It's just under the surface. And as a member of the LGBT community, a lot of us do see queer representation on television, but also there's the issue of queer baiting. So with the J.J. Abrams movies, they promise LGBT representation, and what you get is about 5 seconds of Sulu hugging his partner. It's not good enough. And
I think Kay said he didn't particularly like the fact that they made Sulu gay, just to kind of as a nod to George Takei, separated the actor and the story or the actor and the character are different, and they try to almost merge George. And I think it was supposed to be an homage, but unfortunately they didn't quite get it right. The thing here, I think, is a lot to do. You're talking about heteronormative normal. We also have to kind of think that here in the Republic of Ireland, it was illegal to be gay up until 1980 or 80 something, 90 something. And it's only a couple of years ago, gay people are allowed to get married here in the Republic of Ireland. You talk about Rick Berman and a lot of the stuff. Next Generation was 87 to 93, DS9 onwards, and progressing all the way to 2004. So it was an 18-year stint of that whole kind of team working on stuff. Do you think things have progressed? Because don't forget, in the States, it's a TV show. It has to be successful. As Jerry Bruckheimer describes a lot of his movies, it has to appeal to Ma and Pa in Oklahoma as well as the fans themselves. Because on the top of it, you're selling advertising space to gain revenue, to make a profit. So all these things have to be considered, don't they?
Yeah, it's still a business. Well, you mentioned the States there, so actually I just asked David to come in there. Coming from the States, how do you feel it's progressed over the years?
Looking at it from a completely different perspective, yes, it is a business, and all of these shows are products of their time. While they may be progressive conceptually, they still are a broad reflection of what society was like at the time these shows were produced. Looking back, I always considered things like the host as a more of a prejudicial episode. She was more than happy to consider a relationship when it fit into her definition of what was normal. But when it went outside, she couldn't progress past. Crusher couldn't progress past. Whereas when you look at Dax and Khan, their society does not consider gender as a factor in anything because they do change so much. So the relationship within the story was only taboo from the society point of host's continuing relationship. It did not have a sexual component. It's only when looking at it from a different society viewpoint that you get the problems. And yes, it is a business. If you push the boundaries too far, you're going to experience backlash. And the only way that a consumer in this case can express their displeasure is by not buying the product. And yes, they have to cater's the wrong word, but provide product for a larger growing community that has dollars to spend, a voting block. And the producers are providing a broader range of product to try to make everybody happy. From our point of view, in the States, we don't consider these episodes as anything special other than good quality storytelling. But again, I'm not a member of the community, so it does not have the same type resonance to me that it would have to someone else. My factor is it a good story? It doesn't matter what the characters are like. So, I just let it go. but I was raised what would be considered liberal and progressive, whereas my next door neighbor probably was up in arms with torches, wanting to storm the back lot and go, no, you can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think.
I mean,
Sorry, just in regards to obviously the spending power, I think people forget how much spending power the LGBT community has. So in 2019, we spent 3.7 trillion US dollars. So excluding us and representation of us in films does have a financial impact. I do understand the idea of, maybe not offending audiences, but at the end of the day, we are humans, we exist, and by not representing or educating people about us, then younger people growing up don't see depictions of themselves. We don't normalize it. We perpetuate the idea that we are other, and we let those people win. Plus, Star Trek has always been about inclusivity when we consider the first biracial kiss, never minding the fact it was technically forced due to Plato and all that. But we look at Star Trek as being the epitome of what we want the future to be. And I think if we look at the ethos of Star Trek, that should follow through in the representation within it.
yeah, I mean, that would be true. Like, I mean, I think the situation here, though, is like, if you look at the way these shows, when they were made, the environments that they were made in, it's been a slow progression, just like in political life, the rest of it, like in Ireland, for example, where it's only in the last few years that, marriage equality's come along and attitudes have changed drastically, particularly over the last decade. And, I think we have to take that into consideration. And that's why you see now with the likes of, say, Discovery, they're going full-blooded for it. Like, and they actually have, an LGBTQ couple on the ship. They're not incidental characters, they are regular characters on the show. And it's the first show that's done that, which when I was running the quiz was where I was coming from, because I was going, what is the first LGBTQ couple? And I would say that's them. Like, there's been representation briefly, as you say. It's been, gradual in the manner in which they've sort of started to represent other communities. And they've reached a point now, because of changing attitudes, where with Discovery they're able to portray it properly. And with Picard, they're starting to hint that, say, for example, that 7 of 9 is bisexual. So it's been a slow process, but it's good to see that we're finally getting to a position where we can say that Trek is now really taking a hold of that. John, you haven't come in yet there. I just wanted to say, John, do you have anything you want to add before we spin around again? Oh, you're muted, John.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, done it. No, it's just as Felicity said. I remember years when my first club I joined in 19. The magazines and the magazines, fan/ magazines.
Yeah.
And at that time, I was on. So I remember that. So it's that's the kind of things, and so brought that started at that time. So it happened that time in fan fiction, and as the JJ one that happened as well, but it wasn't mentioned as Discovery. But now trying to bring in Picard as 7 and 9 being that way as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with the fanzines that eventually sort of changed into slash fiction and all of that. It was the only outlet, I suppose, that they had at the time. We're reaching a point now where the mainstream is dealing with this in a fantastic way. Like, just to go off Star Trek for a minute, if you haven't seen Sense8, it's one that's highly recommended. If you want to see how that aspect of life can be explored fully, it's a fantastic show for that. But yeah, I mean, I've there's been some interesting theories about the Kirk and Spock characters, and that it was more than just a bromance. And I think Roddenberry himself said, like, yeah, there was definitely love there. There was nothing on the show physical or anything like that, but he didn't go and say no. He did say it's a possibility, and he he wasn't too put out with the fiction that he saw at the time, like from what I've read there. And there was an episode that didn't air with TNG, I believe, that was written that would have had a couple of minor characters involved in. I think, as Felicity said, they were exploring the AIDS epidemic at the time, and it was going to be involving a virus, and there was going to be a couple, two guys there who would just turn and say, "How long have you been together?" "Since the academy days." It was going to be kind of just a brief sort of a moment where their relationship is mentioned, but that would have been it. Like, but even so, that never made airing, like, you know. So.
Frank, I have a question for everybody else. Just thinking back, as everyone else has been speaking. Did any of you watch they call it New Voyages, where in their story they attempted to tell the story of Jim Kirk's nephew, who was serving on the Enterprise, and he was gay. It was a 2-part episode that James Cawley approached. And I have to say that particular team, while you could argue differences between quality of production between Continues and New Voyages, James and his team really tried to fill in some holes, especially storytelling-wise, in the classic Star Trek era, with some LGBTQ plus storyline with Jim Kirk's nephew having a relationship with one of the medical officers on board the Enterprise. Did anybody else watch that? Anyone else see that? No?
I think I've seen it, but it's not fresh on my mind. I'm currently going through all the canonical series at the minute. Yeah. That would be one. I do remember seeing some LGBT representation in fan-made movies. I know that there was an attempt, I think, to make the unaired episode from the Next Generation in a fan-made movie. I'll wrap it in there. I do remember that being redone with the blessing of the original writer, who I think actually resigned because they refused to air that episode.
Yeah. The point I was trying to get to was I was watching that 2-part episode of New Voyages as a straight guy, accepting that this is stuff that should be shown on TV. However, I don't know who directed it, but it made me feel uncomfortable watching it, and I don't know whether that was how they shot it, because it definitely wasn't the storyline. But I felt that they lingered on things a little bit too long, longer than they would have done. It was almost like they were so, the storylines like this are so desperately missing from some of TV that it felt a little bit too forced. That's why I was wanting to get someone from the community's thoughts and feelings on that particular episode, because I know it was a struggle for me to watch, and I'd want to know whether that was just me, or was that the way it was shot, or the way it was acted and portrayed.
I think you bring up a very good point, and it's something that needs to be discussed pretty well. Is are the producers, directors, creative people bringing this up to put this concept on display, or is it a natural part of the storytelling? A lot of the problem I have with this kind of representation is it does seem forced. It does seem like it's something that they are forcing you to see and address, and not just a proper way to present a story. It's like highlighting Crusher's societal prejudice in the host. It was done in a natural, thoughtful, progressive, logical way, so it didn't bother me. Same thing with Dax and Khan's relationship in that episode. It was a not natural, logical discussion and representation of an idea. It didn't seem forced. So as a straight man in a conservative community, it seemed proper storytelling. And that's what I think should be done, and how you can expose or present these ideas to a broader audience. Make it make sense within the context of the story that you're trying to tell.
Right.
See,
Do you feel that Discovery has achieved that? Like, you know, because
They have.
I know
And
there's been a lot of criticism about Discovery on various different aspects of it. Like, but one aspect that that did come out from some corners was their portrayal of a gay couple on the ship, you know, with Culbert and with Culber and Stamets. Now, you know, I'm a big fan of Discovery, as you can see, but to me, I felt like, you know,
That's one of the reasons, Frank, why I thought you were defending Discovery so much.
No, I enjoy all aspects of it. I have to say, but as you well know, but that aspect of it is one that comes in for criticism by some corners, and I, you know, just what David was saying there about story feeling forced, trying to put something in there just so it's there. I don't get that feeling from Discovery. Do you guys? Or do you feel like they've done a good job in bringing in that representation?
I think in Discovery, and the key difference here is, and this would go over to other marginalized groups as well, such as disabled people. But if you have a character and they're there to be the disabled character or the gay character, you're not actually seeing them just as a person. You are seeing their otherness first. That is what is being put there. Whereas when you actually have true, proper representation, we are seen as just part of the community, your neighbors, your brothers, your sisters, and that shouldn't be what it is, because we are humans at the end of the day. We shouldn't have to have some sort of like familial link. But when you choose to do that, that can change the entirety of representation. And I think it's a theory in disability literature, but it would equate over. But in disability literature, there's this idea of narrative prosthesis, in which a disabled person only exists within the text to be a crutch. So if you think about Moby Dick and other things, the disabled person there is kind of used as a counterpoint to another character, or for a character to learn a lesson, to become a better person, to have been inspired by that person. And again, with like LGBT people, we'll see people maybe being presented, and it's there to allow the straight people to become better people, or they're coded in such a way. And that's not real representation. I mean, it's good to be able to read a narrative within television or within literature and see something that you can say, that there is me. But when it has to have all these barriers around it, it's not really representation. And I think that might be one of the main reasons why some people then feel like this is very much in my face, because they're not approaching it properly.
Yeah, but do you feel that Discovery have, for example, taken the correct approach in portraying these characters?
I think we see the couple, you know, in their everyday lives and around the ship and just working, and I think that's really, really important, because, like, if you think about Tom and B'Elanna, was it we saw them as a couple, but also as they were working around the ship and the intricacies of that relationship. We see the same in Discovery. This isn't to say that it's perfect, but it's definitely a step up. And I think the actors themselves are very aware of what they're representing. And I think that's really important as well, because they've got input into that, as well as the fact that one of the actors is a member of the community themselves. And so, not to put a lot of weight on their shoulders, but I think they know the importance of this. And because of that, I would like to think they would have some input into the script. Because I know Whoopi Goldberg refused to say something in the episode where Data had a child in The Next Generation because they were using heteronormative language. So the actors themselves can have an influence on the script and on what we see. And that can be really important, because that's actual input from people in the community trying to make sure that the representation is right. Because if you're a straight person writing about what the experiences are to be LGBT, you can't fully understand what it's like to be in those shoes. You've got maybe these media ideas and different things that you think it might be like, but the actual experience you can't have lived. And so those voices, I think, are really important to be influencing how this character is developing and how that relationship that we see on the screen is developing.
Yeah. Just to say hi to a few guys, there's quite a few people who've joined us there. Anita, Alan O'Shane, Andrew Brannigan, Andy Quinn, Stephen Parmley. Andrew Brannigan has actually turned around and said that he thought that having a background actor in a wheelchair in Discovery's corridor, that it felt right. You know, it wasn't, you know, put there just to have someone there, but the circumstances involved in it meant that he did it correctly. Like, you know, he was a crew member who was injured somewhere along the way, because you do see him at the party as well, and he's spoken to and all that kind of stuff, and they don't treat him any differently. You know, he's just there in his chair, and you know, so it does seem like, you know, that the franchise has really taken some large steps in starting to represent all aspects of these communities. Like, you know, and it's great to see, you know, and you can see with Picard that they're hinting at things as well. So I think there's a lot of positives to be taken from how things have moved on over the years in the franchise, you know.
It's interesting to note that it is a product of its time. And one thing that would have been scandalous maybe 15, 20 years ago is not only are they a LGBTQ couple, but they're also biracial. You know, that's even not addressed because society has changed to the point where most people overlook that concept. Whereas in the time of TOS, that would have been as scandalous, if not more.
Well, of course, we you know, you had Kirk and Uhura.
Well, that's very true. Like, I mean, you don't even, it's not even a conversation now, you know?
I mean, it was more acceptable for Kirk to be seen with a green than with a person of color.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas at the time of Discovery, no one even raises an eyebrow that they're biracial. They do have some kind of difficulty with the LGBTQ component. That is not an easy acronym to run off your tongue.
No, it really isn't. It's almost like what the SHIELD acronym. It's really hard to get them out around, like, you know, but it's you know, absolutely. Just say hi to another couple of people. Stephen Parley from our CS is here. So hey, guy, how are you doing? I'm switching between two different devices here to say hi to people because one of them is not working very well. But Lee is there.
With Jason Faulkner watching, Farmley, Alan obviously is doing his whole tag everybody in Starfleet. And we've got Anita Malone is out there as well as Andrew Brannigan. So hi guys, how's everybody doing? I wanted to bring up the point.
Yeah, if anybody wants to add an opinion or make a comment, please do. Like, you know, anything that you want to ask or suggest that we discuss during this, you know, please feel free to do so.
What I was going to say was not transferring it away from LGBT, but we were talking about like representation in the shows, and we have the chap in the back in the background on Discovery in a wheelchair, which is, you know, commendable not only because it's just someone's in a wheelchair and a disabled person on the shot, but, you know, a lot of the time someone like that having a consideration for something like that actually adds a lot of, just to have someone like going around the wheelchair adds a lot of cost to a production. You also have to now make your sets wheelchair accessible. You have to, like, if it's a real disabled person, you have to make the set accessible and safe, and it adds an awful lot of cost, which is another, brings it back to the whole business thing. But way back in season 2 of Deep Space Nine, and I think they learned a lot from Next Generation, and then Deep Space Nine, they were, you know, a little bit a different show, darker, pushing storylines a little bit more. And again, you know, not to take away from the LGBT discussion, which is why we're here, but we had the episode called with Melora Paslar, who was from a planet with a thicker atmosphere. So her species flew. So when she came to standard Earth gravity stations or Starfleet vessels, she was confined to a wheelchair. So the story on that was she had to, you know, make the choice. She could have a treatment that Dr. Bashir came up with so that she could walk normally and strengthen her muscles and stuff like that, but lose the ability to go back to her home planet, or keep her disability. Inverted commas. It's a disability, but it's not, because that to exist in our world, again, she confined to a wheelchair, an apparatus to operate in the kind of common standard of Starfleet's gravity. So again, I think that was another storyline to help progress. Now, and the other thing as well is, Felicity and David, correct me if I'm wrong, this side of the pond would be a little bit more ahead of the States, because it's only yesterday that LGBTQ plus rights were solidified by the US and held up by the US Supreme Court with the majority vote. Are we a little bit ahead of the States in regards to this?
While I'm not familiar with the exact political situation on that side, I do know that the rights have been fluctuating back and forth, and unfortunately they tend to be a little regional. Certain states allowing rights where others curtail them. But yes, just within the last few days, the U.S. Supreme Court has made it a sweeping across the board, lumping the that community, only because the acronym is causing my brain to hurt, in with any of the other non-discriminatory concepts. And from a standpoint, it's a matter of, it's none of your business. It shouldn't be a factor in hiring, firing, rights, and so forth. But yes, I would say we are behind the curve comparatively, not only with that side of the pond, but for a large section of the world.
I mean, around the planet there's different things. So what I'm kind of trying to get to the point of is, do you think that, Star Trek being as progressive as Gene set it up, now whether or not Gene was accepting of LGBT himself, but the kind of progressive view that they're trying to put forward within the business model of making a successful television, a lot of the time Star Trek tries to tell real world stories with a sugarcoating of sci-fi, so it's more palatable for people to watch. Do you think it helps in a society, or a lot of the, as they might be called, red states in the United States, to help them accept this more going forward? Do you think it helps people move forward? They see a little story and go, oh, and just like, race relations, Whoopi Goldberg was delighted to be on Star Trek because she saw Nichelle there, and Nichelle was going to leave because she wasn't allowed in the main door of the stage. She was told to go around the back because of her color, so she had to go in the back door and not the main stage door when she was going to work and going to the same scene everybody else was. And there's George Takei, obviously having to hide his sexuality for so long, but he's able to breeze through that door, but she's sent around the back. Do you think, even though the stories may not be where you might want them, Felicity, do you think that there's a progression, there's stepping stones of getting there in the stories to help people who may not be accepting to accept a little bit more?
I think representation can help move acceptance forward. I mean, the UK isn't exactly ideal at the minute. The gender self-identification laws got repealed by the Tory government there. Sorry, what got repealed? So gender self-identification, so some trans rights that have been lobbied for years got repealed due to feminists who call themselves gender critical. It's a whole separate argument, but it's more important than ever that we actually see representation, and especially within fandom. We could use J.K. Rowling as an example of where representation goes wrong, and that she retconned that Dumbledore would be LGBT and then refused to include it in the films. But it's not just representation on screen. As you said there, yes, there are additional expenses to having a disabled person on set, but we don't live in an accessible world. The world, even though they say it's accessible to everyone, isn't. There's buildings people can't get into, there's things that people can't do, and if we made sets accessible from the get-go, there wouldn't be these additional costs in mind. If we took into account the fact that there are people who come in all different sizes, shapes, with different needs, that would be important. And just going back to what you were saying in regards to that episode, I think it was in Deep Space Nine, was it she actually is disabled when she comes onto the ship because she's socially disabled. So there's the social model of disability, and she has arrived on this ship, and the circumstances disable her because of the gravity. And that is what is disabling. She's not necessarily physiologically disabled. There hasn't been something there, but it's a different way of thinking about disability. So when we stop sort of saying that person has this medical thing and that needs fixed, if we look around acceptance and adapting, it makes it more accessible for everyone. So for example, like I had to get grab rails put into my flat, but it means then the next person who comes into the flat has grab rails if they need them. They don't have to go and then access them and source them. The next person who rents it after that, because you don't know who's going to come along. And so representation on screen is important at chipping away the stigma, and also in regards to just sort of challenging assumptions that people have about LGBT couples. And also because it raises a conversation. Granted, sometimes this conversation can be quite difficult in certain fan groups, and a lot of people can think it's quite funny to troll, but it's important to have these conversations, especially if people feel up to doing it. But it's for straight allies to jump in, because it is exhausting having to deal with people who are fans of the franchise, who you would think should understand the importance of representation and the idea of this idealistic future, who then seem to think that Trek is on some sort of diversity push, even though they ignore the history of the franchise, which is really ironic. But overall, it's representation on screen, but it's also changing the fact that we're hiring disabled or LGBT actors to represent those characters on shows, and also putting in adaptations for those disabled actors so that they can be there, because those adaptations then mean that more disabled actors can be there and that representation can grow, and it's just it's better for everyone. Say if you have a non-disabled actor who goes over on their foot, on their own crutches, but you still need to film. If you have a set that's accessible, you can just work that into the script.
Well, I'll jump in on that particular point, because the shows that I work on are medieval, and it's very hard to get representation into that specific type of storyline. I was many years ago, like with a show like what I do, it's not so easy, because I do remember being on set the day Jamie Campbell Bower broke his leg. Got his foot caught in a fight sequence. No, I wasn't in the fray, but all we heard was this almighty scream from just behind the fence that the stunt guys had just leapt over, and he'd snapped his foot. Now, or not his foot, he broke his leg just above the ankle, I believe. But what this did was put the whole production into turmoil for that was the TV show Camelot. Put the whole production in turmoil, and I do believe back then it did start a big communication between the biggest series being shot at the time, of which he was a part, which was Twilight, and Twilight was delayed by 6 weeks because he broke his foot. So this cost a lot of money and spiraled, and never mind a lot of other factors. It probably was a factor of that show didn't actually come back. It ran for 10 episodes one season, and there was more than one unhappy case on that, and a lot of it's to do with budget. So it's tough to do things, but then of course you have way back in the we myself and Frank were talking about it on our quiz nights. Was it Ironside, the old TV show where the character was in a wheelchair? The main character was in a wheelchair, and I don't know whether that was the actor or the story.
No, that
it was a function of the story.
Yeah,
Function of the story.
Very well represented.
Yeah.
The character in this case was shot in the spine, which put him in a wheelchair, and then he went on to another career. And they developed the show with the idea in mind that the character would be a wheelchair. So from the start, everything was designed accessible. And like Felicity was talking about, once you start adding accessibility items into reality, it begins to snowball and allows for others to be involved because the accessibility issues are already addressed. However, we all know it's a production and a dollars issue. You don't think about adding these things in advance until there's a need, and then you have to balance the cost of retrofitting your entire environment for what may be a single storytelling plot point, or crutch character, like you were talking about, which was addressed in the episode with Melora Paslar about the changes that would have to be made to the station. Or is it something that you design in advance and hope you might need sometime in the future later on? It's a dollars balance from a practical standpoint. When you consider the in-universe discussion, it's something that would have already been addressed by the time of, say, Discovery or TOS. But if you look at the design of the sets for Enterprise, large sections of it had what a naval person would call a knee knocker or ridge in the doorways.
Mhm.
And it's because at that point in historical time, they would not have accepted a disabled person in the service. Whereas later on, once they began to accept them, they designed for that in mind.
Yeah.
Because if you look at
That's-
Kirk, every door is smooth. There's no lid, there's no ridges, no door, nor no lips, anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Frank, you going to mention a comment there?
TNG. Oh, sorry. There was a question there from Andrew about what about Worf on TNG wanting to commit suicide when he got paralyzed? Do you feel like that's an interesting take on it, where someone who has been whole and hearty? Do you think they portrayed that quite well?
I think that one is slightly problematic. A lot of the time, when you see a non-disabled character who acquires a disability, media represent it as if their life is over. And that's generally because society views disability as something very bad. And by saying that, it's something for you to get over. So I was out at a bus stop. This is like last year sometime, because obviously we're in lockdown now. But someone said it was inspirational to see someone like me at a bus stop. We're not inspiration, and it shouldn't be inspirational to just live your lives. And I think what the problem was there was they weren't showing that you could live a life with a disability or as a disabled person. And that was a societal issue. And it's really sad to see that was an issue that was existing even in this hypothetical future that's within Trek. It's something that you see an awful lot in movies. So I think is it You Before Me? It's the one with Emilia Clarke in it. And it's a movie about someone who becomes a quadriplegic who wants to die. And again, it's this kind of, like I said previously about narrative prosthesis, he's there to basically teach her character, how to live again and how to love and things like this. He's not there as a disabled character. He's as kind of a crutch, so to speak, for her character and her character's narrative arc. Worf, unfortunately, in that one, I think the writing was influenced by ableist thinking from the writers about what they would have felt, because Worf, yes, he's Klingon, but he's in the Federation. He's on a ship with a lot of humans around him. And if society at that point had really advanced to the extent that disability wasn't seen in that light, perhaps that thinking wouldn't have come about. And also then the problem is, because his character jumps to that conclusion that this is what should happen, it presents to the viewer that that's a normal reaction. And the thing is, it's not, the best way to put it is, like, when you do acquire a disability, especially if it's sudden, it's okay to have like a grieving period for the things that you maybe are no longer able to do. But there might be things now that you can do that you couldn't previously do. You might acquire new skills, different things. That's not presented. It's presented that he feels his life is over. And that's a really dangerous viewpoint for people to get, especially in this idealistic world, because they have lots of technology. They have things that could do. And it wasn't like he didn't have an option. He did have an option, because I think they found those like mechanical legs and stuff like that he could use to be able to get about. He didn't want that. So they had adaptions.
Felicity, just
the question that needs to be addressed here is societal norms in the Federation. And this is a concept that Worf struggled with throughout his entire career. His society had a particular idea on disability. that was in opposition to what the larger federation believed. And he was fighting for his right to do with his society and what his society felt was correct. While it was not what the larger population believed. And this is where I felt that the narrative storytelling held up through examination if you can dissociate yourself from your own viewpoints and consider what his society believed. While your point is incredibly valid, yes, there are other alternatives, but it brings to mind the argument, could those alternatives have been forced on him to accept and against his own cultural beliefs?
Do you guys think that just occurs to me, because thinking of the time, and this is a point I bring up a lot of, talking about story, and what Star Trek's trying to do by bringing up stories, and yes, the 24th century has all of these fixes and things they can do, which could, not that I'm advocating that they should do this, but you could say that with the technology and stuff like that they have, even by TOS, nobody should be in a wheelchair. It can be fixed. Never mind, let's not go down the road of talking about the eugenics wars, but that technology exists to fix things that are wrong if they're prenatal and all that, bringing us forward. So you don't necessarily need to see someone in a wheelchair in this era of fantasy that we're talking about, but it's good to represent for the people now to see. But what just occurred to me for the Worf storyline is that would that be more of an allegory for thinking back in the time and in the 80s? If you think of all of our heroes, most of them being unfortunately male heroes, but they were, all of them predominantly were Vietnam veterans. And a lot of people had been only out of the Vietnam War maybe 15 years by the late 90s. Or 15, coming up on that, 15, maybe 18 years. So Worf's story would be quite fresh in the mind for someone who was injured in the Vietnam War. And a lot of that PTSD was the feeling of, I don't want to live like this. No, nobody fixed me. And they had suicidal thoughts. I'd rather be dead than unable to run through the jungle or run around the block or whatever. Do you think that was the audience that they were trying to go to, or tell the audience, look, by the way, there's a lot of guys in your community that feel like this, that have served your country in whether wrong or rightly, they went out there for America and they came back injured and in a bad place. They don't always think rationally. So let's explore that storyline. Do you think that's what that particular episode was?
I would have thought so. I mean, I don't recall the episode that well, but I would have thought they were going down the route of trying to explore someone who, lives his life in a particular way. He's a warrior, like, for example, a Vietnam veteran or a soldier of any campaign who suffers a terrible injury, and all of a sudden the life he's always led is gone. There's definitely going to be a period where not only are you mourning the loss of your previous lifestyle, but facing the future of not being able to do what you've always done. It's huge. You're going to go through various different stages of depression and all the rest of trying to handle that. And I would assume that they were portraying that episode to show maybe the different stages that someone would go through to come out to the other side of it and say, there's options. But you've got to get through that battle of accepting what's happened to you and moving forward and then going from there. I would assume that's the direction they were trying to go on, but I can't actually remember the episode. But I would have thought, yes, that's what they were trying to portray.
Felicity wants to say something there.
Yeah, so that might have been what they were trying to portray, but I think the main issue is, if you're going to portray someone going through difficulties after acquiring a disability, you need to have other representation of disability within the series that is positive, because if the most notable representation you have generally is associated with negativity, that's not great. And while these are all great conversations to have, and that may have been the intention that they wanted to have in regards to the episode, if you don't have that positive representation, the thing that people take away is negativity in regards to a disability, in that if they themselves were to acquire it, they would then possibly feel like Worf and that their life is over. And if we look at the actual episode, his life technically isn't over. There are options there for him. Yes, this is a Klingon mentality, and maybe there could be allegories to certain types of personalities that humans could have. But his life isn't over. And I think the key thing is it's quite a negative representation of disability from Worf's perspective on that particular episode. And without other representation, it needs the balance, because that is a valid feeling for someone to have after they acquire a disability. It's something lots of people experience. And that's partly because of how society depicts disability, which hopefully they wouldn't be depicting it at that point. But it has to be balanced. So without that other balance, the episode on its own, while we can sort of try and see it in this light, while we are maybe more enlightened and understanding the variety that comes with disability, that particular episode as a standalone, there's nothing to contrast with it for viewers.
Well,
that's where the issue arises.
Would you not think, Felicity, that I think, well, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're so accepting of certain things as the group that we are, because of what we've been watching and our particular views and stuff, that, you know, there is a positive disability on the Enterprise D of Geordi LaForge. Here's an Afro-American male who's also blind and is so good at his job that he's promoted to chief engineer. You know, to run the engines, but he's got a prosthesis, so he is disabled. But we just look beyond that. Do you think we look beyond that?
So Geordi's good. Yeah, so Geordi is good and bad. So Geordi is great in that, obviously, his vision impairment, they don't make a big deal about it. It's just part of who Geordi is. There is the issue, though, in that his visor gives him abilities that the other people don't have. So by virtue of being disabled, he has access to certain things. And it becomes this idea of being a super crip. And so you'll hear people saying, oh, I have autism, that's my superpower. It's not. This is some people trying to make it positive, but there are people within the community who really feel like that's not the way to be going about it, because if you try, it's another way of othering people. So Geordi is accepted, but at the same time, he has abilities that other people on the show specifically don't have by virtue of his disability, and that's also very othering. So it's one of those ones about a fine balance. There's pros and cons to how that's represented.
Okay. Sorry, David, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, I want to back up to the Worf episode for a second. I don't look at it as a problem with disabled. I look at it as an argument for self-determination. And if I remember my timing correctly, this was about the time of the mercy-killing euthanasia period of Dr. Kevorkian, where terminal or long-term patients had the right to, or were arguing for the right to determine to self-terminate. And without a little research, I don't have a second monitor to pull it up, check the timeline. This was the way I determined this episode. I looked at it. He was a individual of sound mind who wanted to choose a particular course of action that was not in alignment with society's norms. And he was fighting not only the stigma of the unpopular choice, but the right to do what he wanted with his own life. That's the way I always viewed the episode, from that viewpoint.
Yeah.
And it was an argument for self-determination in fighting against society's viewpoint. And that's and they were trying to force him into a particular course of action that he adamantly did not wish to have. While it is a very good discussion of the stages of grief and acceptance with disability, I think the underlying argument is, it's my body, it's my right, it's my choice. Allow me to do what I want to do. And to me, that was the way I always viewed the article or the particular episode. I didn't see it from this other viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes to show that we will all take something from an episode like that, depending on what viewpoint we're coming from, you know. And you know, from what you're saying there, you know, people are going to take different things from it. I'd have to revisit that episode. I don't actually remember it all that well. So,
And one of the significant underlying viewpoints from day one was the right of not only the society, but the individual to determine their own course of action, prime directive. But it was removed, or they tried to remove it from Worf when it did not fit in with the Federation's viewpoint on life. So in this case, the Federation, in the force of the Enterprise medical team, was hypocritical. Granted, they have their oath of protect life and do no harm, but but what about the patient's rights?
Yeah. So we're coming up on the hour there.
Yeah, we're getting coming close to it there. And just, you know, to go up, Trek for the moment, there's a fantastic episode in Babylon 5 called Believers, in which, you know, the doctor has to deal with a family who comes aboard the station where the child has a serious illness, you know, needs an operation. And the operation itself is pretty straightforward, but their belief system won't allow them to actually proceed with the operation. It's a first season episode and a very incredibly strong storyline for our first season. And yeah, so, you know, aspects of these type of attitudes, sci-fi has a great way of portraying it in a manner that you can tell the story, allow people to come to their conclusions on it, you know. We are going to
I can't remember what church it is, but I think that was an allegory JMS was doing for the decisions of people like the Church of Latter-day Saints or something. Is it
Christian Scientists?
Christian Scientists, but where even a blood transfusion goes against it. So if they have a disorder, they just can't do it. So I think that was an allegory for that. Sorry, Frank, just on the hour there, I'll just ask this question for around the screens here. So, you know, we've gone from LGBT, which is the point of the discussion, which leads into we've talked about disability, and then, you know, PTSD and all these issues that are brought up in the storylines. And you know, there has been progression. There's a lot of to and fro we hear around the world where, you know, rights are given and then suddenly a conservative government comes in and takes them away. I know up in Northern Ireland they fight for they fight against any progression with the government up there, even against what happens in the UK, and then just south of the border here in the Republic. I think our little country's come an awful long way in how progressive we have, and you know, my major opinion on that is, and it comes from one of our most corrupt politicians ever, but he gave us one of the best things you could ever give a society, and that was access to free education to a certain level. And I think, you know, education is key. That helping people, give people the access to the knowledge, get the knowledge. So the question is, for everybody, what can we do? What can the shows, what would you like to see in the shows? We have this new era of Star Trek and these new storylines. The writers are going down different paths. It's not what we were watching 20 years ago. They're being open-minded in different ways. They're telling stories in different ways. We don't have so many allegories going on. There's different people paying the bills and all that. What do you think we can do with the show going forward? What would you like to see, and how would you think would be the best way to do it?
Well, like, for example, you've got Strange New Worlds coming up soon, thankfully, and I'm really looking forward to that. There's been a couple of rumors going around from really, you know, dodgy YouTube channels, all the rest of it, that CBS are planning to bring Kirk in as a bisexual in that, like, you know.
Oh, I saw that.
Yeah, but, like, you know, it's like George Takei said about Star Trek Beyond. You don't change an established character, and it's the same groups of people that, you know, have spread rumors about Discovery. So I would take that with a pinch of salt. I think that the franchise itself has come in leaps and bounds in telling stories of this nature and in portraying various different communities in that way. And from what they've done so far with Discovery and Picard, and I am sure that will continue with Strange New Worlds as well. it certainly seems to me that the franchise is moving in the right direction, as it has been continuously. Like, it's always been a growing process over the years as attitudes have changed, and it's become, more acceptable and allow them to explore these avenues to a greater detail. Interesting that you said there that Deep Space Nine dealt with a lot of these kind of issues to some degree. It seems to me that the series that dealt more with long-term storytelling had the ability to do that than, say, a series like TNG, which was much lighter and episodic, adventure of the week and all of that, and we're less inclined to explore those in any great detail. I think you need something that has strong long-term.
Well, you don't have time. Yeah, Felicity, what would you think going forward?
So in regards to Kirk and whether or not he's bisexual, I think there's a lot of fans who would consider that Kirk's probably always been pansexual from the get-go. Kirk, because if we take into account that different aliens may have different ways of presenting and understanding gender, Kirk has historically been seen as a character. It doesn't matter who the person is. He tends to like to be in relationships. And so some people would feel that the fact that he doesn't mind if someone is an alien or whatnot means that possibly he would be open to having relationships with people of other genders. So that's always been there. I think when it comes to more representation, I think it's important to have representation that shows people just going about their everyday lives. So say if you have someone who works in engineering, they work in engineering, but they just happen to have maybe a partner and they're in an LGBT relationship. It's not that they are the gay engineer. They're an engineer who just happens to be gay. In regards to disability, I think more representation would be interesting to see, but also discussion about accessibility. So it could be interesting, say, if they went on an away mission and they had a team member who maybe comes up against something where something isn't accessible, and it raises a discussion about why it's important to make their ship accessible for people. Because a lot of people don't take accessibility into mind until it's something that's impacting them directly. And so in that way, they could depict it, and then also depict positivity of actually putting access needs in place. There's lots of ways they could go about it. And these don't necessarily need to be allegories, but hopefully more LGBT representation, because there's a lot more of us in the community than I think people realize. I think it'd be nice to see some trans representation, trans and non-binary representation possibly coming up, but hopefully not necessarily in the allegory of an alien. But it looks like they're on the right track, because like with J.J. Abrams, they said that they were going to depict Sulu as gay, and all of the PR for that movie queer-baited everybody into thinking that there was actually going to be full representation. And again, it was only about 5 seconds of screen time. So long as they actually have representation, but they don't queer code or queer bait and sort of like put out tiny breadcrumbs, proper representation is really what I would like to see.
Very good. John, do you want to add anything there as well to John's question?
Yeah. I was going to say. Yeah. It's not LGBT or anything like that, but more for the overweight people. They should do more for it. They did the episode Valiant. There's one Starfleet officer who was overweight, which I think there should be more of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's
you see them,
people in general. Yeah.
You want them to address the like obesity? It would be a story.
Yeah.
Right. Obesity. Yeah,
because there's more people obese. Not being able today, but America, there's more obese people in America than there are in this country. So it's unfair that the Starfleet are all thin and straight and nice.
Well, I think part of that, John, is the fact that Starfleet's supposed to be, it's a military, so you have to be able to pass physical exams and physical tests and stuff like that. You have to be able to operate in an emergency. You have to be able to get through that door. There's a certain element, like that's another thing I tend to bring up about Star Trek, which is obviously my favorite show. But the thing I like to bring up is don't forget, if you want to fly around these lovely ships, these beautiful ships, you have to join the military, which is again to me an allegory of the United States. You know, you want all these wonderful things, you got to serve. You forget, and that's where Star Trek started. Well, for me, it started in the Next Generation, but obviously in the '60s. And their ship of explorers. But then at the end of Deep Space Nine, the Starfleet went to war, and again in Discovery, you go to war, and it becomes what leader do you have? Not everybody's got Picard in charge, and not everybody's sitting pretty, going out exploring the rims and scanning microbes and stuff like that. You might be on the borders with the Zenkathi, or whenever the Dominion come in, or up against the Borg, and then suddenly this wonderful world you live in turns into military and do what you're told, and like, okay, the engine's going to break, the only person who can fix it is you, but you have to go down that toxic Jeffries tube. You go and do it, and you have to go, yes sir, I'll go and commit suicide to fix the ship and save everybody. That's the thing about we forget about Starfleet is it is a military, even though we'd all probably love to sign up. So one of the things, just going back there, I know we got to talk to David, but we just talking about representation in other shows. We've got the story of Bortas in the Orville, where they're a monosexual culture. You're not allowed to change, and they will, again, just like the episode of Next Generation, they will change you back. And they, those two guys have a kid to consider, and what's the best for the child going forward within their society. The Orville have gone into that storyline. But yeah, so that's but obesity would be something that possibly should be tackled in the future. It's something that maybe they've avoided.
Just going to say that the roles are a little overweight, so I think there is representation there, but it only seems to be when we see it in people who are in management roles or further up within, and not necessarily on the ships. So if there is representation within that, it suggests to me that that sort of representation can exist on the ship. And we do have
a civilian role. Yeah, I mean, I suppose some of the ships have civilians on board as well in different tasks. So you could do it in that manner. I don't see it as realistic in portraying that in the military aspect of the show. Interestingly, for example, for Wednesday we're reviewing the first episode of Space Above and Beyond, and I watched it there last night. And again, that's another military show, and you see the type of training, Starfleet or Marine Corps, or whatever it is, the type of training they have to do to be a member of that type of this crew, of that military. You've got to be fit, you've got to be healthy, you've got to, the obesity question, I think absolutely they could portray it, but it would need to be, to be realistic in a civilian capacity, Sorry, David, it was your turn there.
No, I'm going to two-part this. You guys have covered the obesity issue well. As a pseudo-military organization, there would be certain fitness standards. Yes, we do see some larger framed, larger bodied people. They're usually people of more advanced age or more advanced parts in their career, where they're no longer line serving type people. But yeah, to fit into the narrative structure, it would probably have to be a civilian support population to deal with the obesity issue. When you consider the idea that medical advances have come to the point where any biochemical issues would have been resolved. And with the ability to always get balanced meals from a replicator, there's no excuse for non-caloric balanced, non-nutritive balanced meals. Okay, stop. Next subject. I always look at the shows from a narrative standpoint. Whatever they say, does it fit into the narrative structure? Is it good storytelling? Is it good character development? One of the problems that I see potentially coming up as we become more and more idealistically inclusive, we lose some of the potential narrative conflicts. They're going to have to become more and more contrived, manufactured, or outside of the structure of the show to fit in. or it's going to have to be a character crutch come in who does not have the same belief structure where the other members of the crew have, which is where I think that Strange New Worlds is likely to go when they go back to their Monster of the Week episodic format. They will begin to discover all of these societies that we had conflicts with to begin with, Orions, Rigilians, or whatever, Capellans. Then they now show how these societies fit into the Federation structure. I feel that there are stories out there, but they're going to have to be more creative to avoid the tropes that they used 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or 50 years ago that were easy storytelling hooks. And they're going to have to be more creative to find out ways to reflect the society that now exists, not the one that existed 15, 20 years ago. So I'm curious to see what's going to happen and where they're going to find their stories from, because the easy societal hooks, controversies, problems, issues are not there anymore. Like I said with Culber and Stamets, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, an interracial relationship would have blown the roof off. Now it's a non-issue, so they potentially lost a storytelling concept.
So do you think the next step is so like we've gotten to that point? So and I as you aptly mentioned earlier on, people are concentrating on Stamets and Culber as being gay, and completely ignoring the fact that they're biracial, which is fantastic. Everyone's just completely looking past their skin colors, which is brilliant. To see what this is. So do you think the next step is we've gone through all these, that's now acceptable. We've got such a combination there with those two. Is a trans character in an arc storyline, like, their character's progression maybe in Strange New Worlds could be someone who is going through that psychological change. Because I've known quite a number of people who have done the change, and within the system in the UK, to get the help, you have to do so many years of psychological referments, constantly coming back just to make sure that this is definitely the change. We're going to do the change. You still, 2 years later, is this definitely, how your brain is still in this particular position? Good. Okay. Now we're going to do hormone replacement therapy, and now we're going to start doing that. And then the final level is many, many years later is for some is, that big decision, operation.
I mean, not to step on Felicity's toes here, because she's probably better on this concept than I would be. It's one of those things where, yes, that story can be something that's involved, but it should be realistically portrayed and not a primary issue, because realistically in modern society, it is a non-issue, or it should be. And it should be one of those where no different than anybody dealing with a broken limb or anything like that. Okay, well, you were in a cast, the cast runs for 6 weeks, 6 weeks of show time, then you deal with the cast again. But it shouldn't be something that is a major focus, because it really is a non-issue, or should be a non-issue.
What do you feel about that?
I mean, that could be brought up.
How would you feel that? Do you think it should be shown, or as David says, do you think we're at the point where they might mention it in one episode, 3 episodes later they make another mention to it, but it shouldn't really? We should just accept it at this stage, or is that something you would like to see a progression of, like being openly spoken about in the episode, just to get that representation on screen?
It's a matter of storytelling. If it's good storytelling, sure, I'd love to see the story. If it's just put in there as a gimmick, no, leave it out.
Felicity, what do you think?
Yeah, so it's one of those things that I think you can have a nice long storyline out of it. And so if you did have a nice long storyline, it wouldn't necessarily be something that you just throw in there as a tokenistic way to say it's there. You would see full representation. So you would see the journey that a person goes on without it necessarily being focused on that. So someone could just drop into conversation, or, you know, how was things, you're back from whatever, and it would be very normalized. At the same time, I think it's really important to mention that not every trans person does have surgery, and that could be a discussion that's raised possibly within, if they go and see the doctor on the ship, and discussions with that. And also, there's different changes, because like if we look at the doctor when it came to 7 of 9, there were discussions on, you know, what hair color, and just like there's ways of changing. But even with Data's child, we looked at Data. Data gave their child the choice of what gender or what race they wanted to have, and the way they presented that was really quite normal. Data just saw it as quite normal to suggest that their child would choose. And so for this sort of representation, I think the best way to do it would be a slow progression through the series. Maybe in one episode, you've got a much larger overarching storyline, but that person then maybe goes and sees the doctor. So you drop a couple of breadcrumbs there, but you get to see the full picture, instead of just having an episode where they go, oh, hey, this person's trans now, that's new, out of absolutely nowhere, because it's not realistic. Obviously, it takes time and there's a process behind it. And I think that would be important, and there's a way of doing it without making it really othering to that character. So the normal,
like David says, as long as it makes sense to the story and there's a good story there, that could be the next progression for the LGBTQ plus community, to see someone in the background. You know, it's not the A story or the B story of this. The A story being the episode's storyline, the B story being the season storyline, and then the C and D would be the personnel storylines kind of progressing in the background as we learn more and more about those characters. So you think that's something that'd be good to be seen?
Yeah, because it wouldn't be realistic to have it resolved in a single episode. But I also think when we were talking about the fact that the couple in Discovery, it's an interracial couple, I think if we were to have trans representation, trans people of color are more likely to be murdered. And I think it's really important to have more trans people of color represented on screen, and especially to have their stories represented. So if they were casting, I think that would be an important way to go down and an area to explore.
Mm-hmm. Now, like one of the things, like obviously on Maker Chat, I'm building the TARDIS here. So, and I've been going through old episodes of Doctor Who, and I think Doctor Who tries to do as much as it can in its particular kind of slot within the BBC and their restrictions. You know, like I agree with what you're saying, and you know, seeing a colored person or African American, sometimes I get confused what's acceptable these days. You know, since we're 5 white people discussing it here on this discussion, but that'd be good to see for that. But again, we got to remember that now Strange New Worlds and Discovery are shot in Canada with American money. Picard is shot in Los Angeles with American money. And even Brannon Braga, you can see it on the Blu-rays of the DVDs of Enterprise, he said that when Enterprise got cancelled, the people on this side of the pond, when he was at conventions, were going, why? What? They didn't understand. So they really didn't get it. So what we've got to really think about is the people who are funding these shows. And again, don't forget, because people keep saying this, but Star Trek is a Netflix show. It's not. I keep reminding people that it is a CBS All Access show. CBS own the rights, and whether CBS and Paramount merge back together is a question. I don't know if it's happened, if it's happening, if it's still going to happen in the future, which is the movie rights and the TV rights coming back together and using those two characters, all those things all together. But why I'm saying that is, again, it comes back to who's funding the show. And those people, those stakeholders, those shareholders, they have a say in what's represented. And that's why the writers have to sugarcoat these things. So going forward, why that will be great. What do you think with the current climate? We've got elections coming up in November, David. It's almost like a second civil war over there at the moment in certain cities. What do you think? How do you think America? Because unfortunately, that is the populace that's paying for the shows that we love. How do you think that that would be accepted over there with what's going on around you in Arkansas?
Where I am in Arkansas did not have a lot of impact. The next town up from us had a spate of riots that affected their community. The thing that I think is most likely to happen is that there will be some addressing of societal issues in the any cinematic presentation. It's always been a reflection of the community that exists at the time and in the area that the product is being made. I do think that over the next short period of time, the concept of rights, privilege, race relations will be a major popular culture issue. And depending upon how our society here in the States shakes out, will determine how these are will be represented. There is a growing groundswell of disapproval of the writing that's going on, because a lot of people are beginning to suspect that there's a disconnect between the underlying issue and the violence that's occurring. And I think it's symptomatic of some issues that are generations informing, not just along race or privilege lines, but just a change in society where the ideas are changing and we're having growth pains. How that will reflect in productions, it's going to show up should these productions show up once the major issues are determined and the underlying causes are found. Those will be displayed. Right now, it's a little too hectic to find out what would be the story. And if anything's in production now, it represents anything from a month to pre-COVID ideas.
Yeah,
so we don't know.
Yeah. It's you can always hope that Star Trek will be leading the way when it comes to telling those stories and showing in an allegory type of way the issues of the time and how they're affecting people, but it's well past the hour then, so I just want to do the draw for the patch and thing that this drove this whole rather deeper discussion that we would normally have on our page, but with that in mind, we're halfway through Pride Month, so I hope everybody who is celebrating Pride continues to have a fantastic month, and we'll all things considered, having to be locked down, not being able to do the parades now, that can still see it as having been a brilliant month. So without further ado, let's see who has won. And the winner, let's see if I can show you that. Anya Marie. I can't really pronounce the surname. What's that now? So you done?
Hold it up again.
Yeah.
Hold it up again. There we go. Blown out. Anne-Marie something.
Anne-Marie. Anya, sorry, it's Anya Marie.
There you go. That's the proof.
There you go. So, Anya, PM me your address details and I'll send those on to you. So yeah, guys, that's been quite an interesting conversation and quite a deep one for what we would normally have on the US School Color, but given the month that was in it and all the stuff was going on, I think it was worth having, and it was fantastic to have you guys along to actually talk about all of this. Next time around, we'll get back to normal sort of light, cheerful, chatty stuff like episodes. TV shows. I'd like to have a little chat about Blake 7 and Babylon 5 and various different shows that we've been talking about over the last few weeks as we've watched them and all of that. So we'll see where that goes. But any last thoughts? That anyone would like to add before we finish up?
We haven't offended anyone, have we?
I wouldn't think so. That's not where we're. No.
I think echoing just sort of happy Pride to everybody, because obviously we're in a lockdown at the minute and we can't really be out as we would normally be at this point. But also just to reiterate that, at least from my perspective, that Pride and other marginalized groups such as people of color intersect an awful lot. And so my Pride this month is taking into account people of color within the community and focusing on how Black Lives Matter within the LGBT community. So that would be my takeaway point, just when we're discussing representation within Trek and all these different things, to maybe reflect on representation within our own lives and also the intersection of different marginalized groups and how that might have an impact on their lived experience.
Brilliant. Thanks, Felicity. David, any last words there?
I can't top what Felicity said. The idea of IDIC applies and acceptance without pushing the forcing of acceptance. I fought for quite a while for everybody to have their own opinion. Just allow me to have mine too.
Very good. Thanks, David. John, do you want to add any last words?
I need to say that I know it's Black Lives Matters in America, but it should be all life matters. It should be all life matters. Yeah.
John?
Well, I think my final thoughts is, to be honest, everyone we're speaking to, anybody who's watching this, the people who've stuck around for the 90 minutes, you know, we're preaching to the converted. I mean, everybody we know has none of these prejudices. All the people in the Coca-Cola and the Roll around Region 20, Region Starfleet International, we've all grown up on these idealisms. I'll mention it. I'm not going to go into it, but I was asked recently by a friend of mine who is a devout Catholic and a science fiction fan living in Las Vegas. She's a doctor of dramatic arts, and she leads a rosary every week. And she talks about, I tell her what we're doing here, what goes on, and you know, we chat. We're friends. And one of her friends asked her, how can you have a moral standing without being Christian? And without going down that whole religious track, to me, that's a lot of that is the teachings of what they try and give us on Star Trek. I started watching in '87 when I was 7 with Next Generation, and I think there's a lot of great stuff that they've attempted to say. They may not have been able, they may have had their hands tied to saying everything that they wanted, but I think representation within our favorite show has come an awful long way. And as Felicity said, you know, the best way to go forward is to possibly, you know, do trans, you know, and a colored trans person having their storyline kind of told in the background, so it's an accepted thing. So I think that's the place where we've come from and where we need to go. We're still on that journey, but I think everybody out there that's watching, we're all on the same page, to be honest.
Yeah. I think it's one of the things I've always loved about being part of the Star Trek and sci-fi community generally, going to conventions and going to various different events, is seeing the inclusiveness and the acceptedness of people for other people. You know, anytime I've gone to a convention in the UK or here, you know, nobody's being judged on what they're wearing or how they're acting. You know, I mean, it's all like we're all here together to have a good time and have fun with each other, like, you know, and I think it's great to see. So that's brilliant, guys. Thanks so much for coming in on this one on short notice and having a very, very interesting discussion, I must say. Next up will be Jono's Maker Chat on Wednesday.
Tomorrow
And then tomorrow evening will be the Q Forward to talk about the pilot episode of Space Above and Beyond. So that will be a very interesting discussion there as well, and it's always a bit of fun. So
yeah, guys, join me tomorrow at 1 o'clock, where we'll have a little bit more look at that.
Excellent. Seems to be progressing very well.
All right.
Listen, guys, thank you so much. We'll talk to you all very soon. Live long and prosper.
Yeah.
Look.
Take care.